A subversive movement exploded in the capital of Aragua early this morning, and some units of this garrison are involved in this movement. In the rest of the Republic, there is absolute tranquility. The government is receiving demonstrations of support from all sectors adhering to its cause and offering to fight, with weapons in hand, in defense of the sacred principles that involve the strengthening of the nation and the fulfillment of a higher destiny.
On January 23, 1958, the Venezuelans woke up to the news that President Marcos Pérez Jiménez, after a new statement from the armed forces, had left the country in the presidential plane. Thus, Venezuela began the day with a new government made up of 5 military men and headed by Rear Admiral Wolfgang Lara Zabel. This event marked the end of an era for Venezuela and the start of a new stage for the nation. It's impossible to explain an outcome like that of January 23rd by merely pointing out the events that took place in the early hours of that day, just as it would be simplistic to attribute his downfall to the actions of the Patriotic Board, a clandestine opposition group that brought together members of the main political parties and civil society. That's why today we're going to tell the details of the fall of Marcos Pérez Jiménez, as few broadcasters have done. From the start of his term in 1952 until 1957, General Marcos Pérez Jiménez conducted his administration without many problems. The country was experiencing an oil boom, the economy and public finances were solid, security and social harmony were stable, and the large tax revenues were used in projects and in the construction of public works for the benefit of the Venezuelan population. The only opposition capable of provoking a political change was the armed resistance of Acción Democrática, but after numerous failures against the national security of the government, its members were discouraged and the frequency of their subversive activities had decreased. However, in the year 1957, a problem presented itself to his government. Soon the constitutional term of his presidential mandate would be exhausted, so he needed to resolve the uncertainty of the presidential succession and the political opportunity that this would give to his opponents. He consulted a solution to this problem with Laureano Vallenilla Lance Planchard, his main political advisor and Minister of Interior Relations. His confidant proposed 3 options. The first was to organize a free election with all parties included, allowing the return of authorized exiles and releasing all political prisoners. The second was a repetition of the 1952 elections, with an official candidate competing against a partisan opposition but restricted. And the last alternative was a return to indirect election through the Republic's Congress. None of the proposals excited the president, so he presented a counter-proposal, a plebiscite in which he would be the only candidate and the electorate would only have the option to vote in favor or against the continuation of his government. Vallenilla Lance opposed the idea, but Pérez Jiménez's insistence won. The 4th of November of 1957, the general announced in the Legislative Palace the mode of the upcoming elections. According to his words, open quotes, "The project proposes a universal formula to express one's opinion of the current regime. We want the largest number of countries' inhabitants to freely express what they think about their government. And for this purpose, a plebiscite is proposed, through which it will be determined whether one agrees with the actions of the regime, and therefore whether it is considered that the person who has held the presidency of the Republic in this period should be re-elected," close quotes. Pérez Jiménez believed he should govern for another period because there were important projects to be finalized, while choosing any of the proposals from his minister implied a huge risk for the continuity of his mandate, because his government lacked a political party that would allow him to group his supporters, and the president's closeness with the people during those years was minimal. Neither was there a man in sight who could effectively continue the work of the previous government. Pérez Jiménez disdained the idea of organizing an intelligent mass politics, as Juan Domingo Perón did in his time. He claimed that intelligent people are convinced by facts and foolish people are convinced by words. The truth is that Pérez Jiménez was not a man of politics, but a statesman who mistakenly did not give enough importance to politics for state stability. On the other hand, the general feared a military coup might be brewing in response to the announcement of free elections, as it was likely that military leaders would not tolerate the election of a civilian from a political party. It was a fear based on the deep discontent that still existed within a significant sector of the armed forces towards the left and all the excesses of democratic action during the Aragua Triennium and the armed resistance. In fact, the military maintained its opposition to the left even after Pérez Jiménez's fall from power, and the next government, headed by Rear Admiral Wolfgang Larrazabal, had to deal with conspiracies that sought to expel the Aragos and communists from the country's political scene. But this will be a topic for another video. The plebiscite was finally celebrated on December 15, 1957. According to official figures provided by the Supreme Electoral Council, his new presidential term was approved with 86.7% of the votes. The election results included the ratification of his candidates to the National Congress, the legislative assemblies, and the municipal councils. Pérez Jiménez had the support of the Italian community living in the country. The electoral law allowed foreigners residing in Venezuela for over 2 years to vote. The Italian embassy encouraged the local Italian community to vote in support of the government's continuation. The opposition party, grouped in the Patriotic Board, didn't take long to disavow the results of the plebiscite. They published a manifesto asserting that the results offered by the government were a fabrication by the Ministry of the Interior. They maintained that the plebiscite had failed because supposedly the people didn't go out to vote at the polls. However, an event of greater significance shook the political scenario of Venezuela that until then, in the eyes of the population, seemed favorable to the government of the new national ideal. In the early morning of January 1 of 1958, a rebellious military movement erupted in the city of Maracay. Weeks before its execution, the coup was brewing in various hidden conversations. A significant focus of discontent within the armed forces was centered on the Urdaneta barracks in Caracas. The implicated individuals made contact with the officers of the Pious barracks in Maracay, and thus the movement extended to that city. As the group of officers who were conspiring were of lower ranks, they sought the support of higher-ranking military officials, contacting Hugo Trejo, who assumes the direction of the movement, although they also established contact with civilians. It must be noted that the Patriotic Board was unaware of the existence of the military conspiracy. The coup was scheduled for January 5, 1958, but, as usual, the plan was discovered by the government. On the morning of December, 2 high-ranking officers suspected of being involved in the plot were arrested: General Hugo Fuentes, commander of the ground forces, and Colonel Jesús Maron Castro Leotlarín, head of the Air Force's general staff. The arrests alerted the rebels, and out of fear of being captured, they decided that they needed to act sooner than planned. However, Pérez Jiménez wrongly believed his government security apparatus had the situation under control. He celebrated New Year's at his home carefree. But in the early hours of January 1st, he was awakened by a call informing him that the entire Air Force was in rebellion. The scene before him appeared gravely serious. It was a breakdown of the unity of the armed forces, an institution in which he had placed all his trust since his rise to power. Around 7 in the morning, Air Force planes began to fly over the capital, attacking key points in Caracas with bombings and machine guns. Among the rebels' targets were the Miraflores Palace, the Ministry of Defense, and the La Carlota military airport. The air attack was not effective because the cannons of the anti-aircraft batteries managed to defend Caracas, and the pilots did not receive help from the rebel units in the capital. This caused damages and, most importantly, panic among the population. Hours later, in the afternoon of the same day, Hugo Trejo, the leader of the movement, was in the Urdaneta barracks, sufficiently prepared to head towards Miraflores. He had the necessary ammunition and tanks to take over the government palace. However, in a decision to this day inexplicable in the military history of Venezuela, he chose instead to march towards Los Teques, the capital of Miranda State, where he established his headquarters, hoping to reinforce the Maracay rebel movement from there. Meanwhile, the morale of the soldiers who had risen in Maracay was faltering due to uncertainty.
I want to declare to the nation that at this moment, 4 powerful columns are moving on the capital of Aragua, which are going to act in different directions. And we are ready to reach a decision within a few hours. I declare, if the rebels in Maracay can hear me, that their senseless act will come to an end shortly. And if they do not lay down their arms, they will be inevitably annihilated. I recommend the people of Venezuela to stay calm. The government has sufficient means to ensure order and establish peace.
Pérez Jiménez tasked Colonel Roberto Casanova with the task of crushing the aviation revolt in the city of Maracay, led by Major Martín Parada. Upon arriving, he met little resistance and gained full control of the barracks. Desperate due to the imminent failure of the uprising, the involved aviators took General Pérez Jiménez's presidential plane and, piloted by Major Parada, flew to Colombia. After the rebellion in Maracay was quelled, Pérez Jiménez and his allies, who had been taking refuge, finally breathed a sigh of relief. But Hugo Trejo's forces in Los Teques were still missing, knowing that Trejo's soldiers were demoralized. Someone suggested that a plane scatter pamphlets over the rebel camp urging them to surrender. Shortly after having received the pamphlets, the last revolutionary focus surrendered, thus ending the unsuccessful coup. In a message to the nation, Pérez Jiménez announced the defeat of the rebels and praised the loyalty of the troops who had not joined the attempted coup. He stated that the failure of Hugo Trejo's rebellion was a great demonstration of unity within the armed forces. However, nothing could be further from the truth than his words. In fact, the unity within the military institution had not strengthened, but rather had broken. For the first time since the overthrow of President Rómulo Gallegos in 1948, and although he spoke confidently in public, the general knew that thwarting a military rebellion was much more difficult than pursuing armed civilians, but untrained. A few days later, another rebellion broke out, this time led by young Navy officers. 5 destroyers set sail from the port of La Guaira without orders from high command. Pérez Jiménez entrusted the Chief of Staff, General Rómulo Fernández, with the task of calming the rebels and determining the extent of the conspiracy. Fernández managed to reach an agreement with them, but later that same day, General Lobera Páez left Caracas armed with a column of tanks and heavy artillery to disarm them. He asked all the ships to hand over their ammunition, and they reluctantly obeyed. With every display of discontent from the armed forces, Pérez Jiménez's hold on power was put in even greater jeopardy. A decision made during these times of crisis, he ended up distancing the 2 men who had accompanied him throughout his term and who were essential for the political management of his government. Laureano Vallenilla Lanz Planchart, his Minister of Interior Relations, and Pedro Estrada, the Director of National Security. He asked them and the members of his cabinet to resign in order to reorganize his government and thus find institutional stability. Amidst all the chaos and dissatisfaction, some members of civil society began to speak out against the government. On January 14th, the Intellectuals' Manifesto was released, containing 8 requests and accusations against Marcos Pérez Jiménez's government. The document was printed in a small clandestine press of the Communist Party. Its main promoters were Pedro Ortega Díaz, from the Communist Party of Venezuela, Fabricio Ojeda, from Democratic Republican Union Miguel Otero Silva, among other characters. They collected signatures supporting the manifesto's content. For their part, the members of the Patriotic Board closely watched every novelty in the government of Pérez Jiménez. Emboldened by military uprisings, they took advantage of the situation to distribute more pamphlets and organize new demonstrations. The renowned Andres Bello High School in Caracas was temporarily shut down due to ongoing disruptions by students. And as a last action before the fall of Pérez Jiménez, the Patriotic Board called a general strike for January 21st. Although the strike was not fully attended and lacked the expected reach, the expected end of Pérez Jiménez's government came on January 23, 1958. The final military statement against him started on January 22nd at 6 p.m. the day before. The uprising was started by the Navy, and then the military school joined, directed by Colonel Pedro José Quevedo. He put his commitment to the military rebellion before his close friendship with the president since the school days. Quevedo began to mobilize to unite more units to the rebellion, and Pérez Jiménez, for his part, dedicated his first moves to seeking allies within the institution through phone calls. But despite all of this, the correlation of forces was still in favor of the government, which had the necessary means to quell the new rebellion. The commander of the Bolivar Armored Battalion remained loyal to Pérez Jiménez until the end. He had control of the tanks, heavy weapons, and everything needed to put up a strong resistance and prevent other units from deserting. The battalion commander requested permission to march on the military school with his military power and neutralize the insurgents. In fact, when weighing the situation, he felt that the mere threat of a bombing would force the cadets, who were only armed with rifles, to surrender. However, due to his opposition to shedding blood to those cadets and his lack of will to defend power at all costs, Pérez Jiménez never gave the order and hastened his departure from the country. At 2 a.m. on January 23rd, the country received the news that General Marcos Pérez Jiménez had been ousted from power. Rather than act like a dictator willing to use weapons to stay in power, he preferred to leave Venezuela without resistance. Among all the factors that converged in the fall of the Pérez Jiménez dictatorship, the influence of the United States has been excluded from the official narrative. While it's true that Venezuela's political and commercial relationship with the foreign power was good during the early years of the Pérez Jiménez government, later the relationship worsened due to multiple disagreements between the two governments. Among all the disagreements and conflicts that arose during those years, the proposal from Pérez Jiménez to create a large international economic fund for the economic redemption of the American countries, a project that would reduce the influence of the United States on the economy of the region, where, in addition, it was required to provide funding. Like all nations, it was what most upset Washington, and while all of this was happening between the two countries, Romulo Betancourt managed, from his exile in the United States, precisely to establish strong bonds of friendship with important people in American politics. For instance, Dean Acheson, the former State Department secretary, who would later become a key piece in the extradition of Pérez Jiménez from the United States to Venezuela, and also developed strong ties with figures like Nelson Rockefeller, a prominent American oil magnate who would also become vice president of his country, and that later, under the bipartisan democracy in Venezuela, he would become the owner and shape significant sectors of the Venezuelan economy. This is how progressively United States interests aligned with those of Pérez Jiménez's opposition. In this context, in December of 1957, the main political parties signed a pact in New York to stay united in the fight against Pérez Jiménez's government. The New York Pact was signed by Romulo de Tancú, Rafael Caldera, and Jovito Villalba. It is considered a precedent of the Punto Fijo Pact, which would later be ratified in Venezuela. 60 years later, January 23rd is still intensely debated. This momentous date has been utilized by political parties to construct an epic around the origin of Venezuelan democracy. This version of events has painted the fall of Pérez Jiménez as the result of a unity between civilians and the military for a common purpose. But in reality, the outcome of this government, as we have demonstrated throughout this video, should be explained by two key factors that have not received enough emphasis. The first, the breakup of the unity of the armed forces, an institution on which he had relied for his continued power. And second, the lack of audacity and momentum of Marcos Pérez Jiménez to resolve the internal problems of his government during the last moments of crisis. Perhaps demoralized by the reaction of some armed forces that he considered to have elevated to their highest level in history, and the reaction of political sectors that erroneously he thought that only with facts would they be convinced. Perhaps also indisposed and lacking the political ambition that characterized his adversaries. Neither the Patriotic Board nor any other element related to civil society were architects of the military breakup. The pamphlets and student protests alone failed to create a significant emergency within the armed forces. In conclusion, January 23rd was the result of several political mistakes. At times when, in order to stay in power, Pérez Jiménez needed to take effective solutions with cold blood. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching this video. If you haven't done so, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, your appreciations, your suggestions. Like this and all other videos, hit the bell so you get notifications of all our publications. And of course, follow us on our Instagram account, where we post supplementary material to everything we do on this channel. See you next time. Take care.